And this afternoon we have Badal Garbi talking about freedom out of the box. Thanks.
Yep, thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? Does the sound okay in the back? Yep, good, thanks. It's really hard as a speaker to know whether the mic stuff is working right without asking. So first of all, thanks to all of you and/or your peers at the conference for voting to have me come do this again. It is, of course, a great honor to be asked to repeat the talk. On the other hand, I'm actually a little under the weather today. I'm fighting sinusy stuff, as you can probably tell by listening. I think I'll be okay for the talk, but you know, it's not your fault if I end up, you know, getting all congested and having to pause for a moment. So before we get started, let me ask out of curiosity, how many of you in the audience have not heard me give a talk at a conference before? Oh, excellent. I'm so glad so many of you came that, you know, must not have been in here the other day. So that begs the other question. How many of you that are in here now also heard me give this talk the other day? Yeah, see, you're just masochists. Okay, well, let me explain for those of you who haven't heard me talk before just a little bit about who I am. I tell people I made my first personal contribution of source code to this thing we now call free software open source in about 1979. And I've been a continuous contributor over the years since. I am probably best known in the free software world for my contributions over the years to the Debian project. I helped to start or make real 5 different ports of Debian to different processor architectures. I was the elected Debian project leader back in 2002, 2003. I've been chairman of the Debian Technical Committee for a while. I'm president of Software in the Public Interest, which is an umbrella organization that provides services to Debian and a number of other projects. And most recently, I've also been serving on the board of directors of both the Linux Foundation, where I represent individual members of the foundation, not my employer, which is an interesting distinction to point out to my employer sometimes. And I'm also a member of the board of directors of the Freedom Box Foundation. And it's the activities at the Freedom Box Foundation that I want to try and give you something of an update on today. So what's this all about? Well, before I dive in, let me ask a few questions. How many of you in the room have Facebook accounts? Okay, not surprised. Twitter accounts? Flickr? Google Plus? Okay, so most, probably not all, but most of you raised your hand at least once. I'm not surprised. I actually have one of each of those too. And there are all sorts of really neat things that we're able to do these days because people have created interesting services like that that allow us to share objects, artifacts, photos, documents, references to interesting things we think our friends should go take a look at, and so forth. And that has certainly led to, you know, a sense of empowerment, a sense of connectedness, an ability to interact with and communicate with our friends and family that, you know, frankly, we probably haven't ever had before. But there is another side to that, and that is a set of unintended consequences that I'm not sure all of you have very consciously thought about. If you were here for Jake's keynote this morning, you probably have some sense of where this is going before I even say anything else. But you need to realize that every time you participate in that kind of corporately operated, centralized social networking system, that for every benefit that you and the folks around you acquire from that participation, there is some unintended consequence with respect to the ability of others to see what you're doing, to learn about who you and your friends are, and to have access to information that you might not voluntarily have chosen to give them if you'd been asked and had gone through a conscious thought process about what that trade-off was in advance. And so, to some extent, what we're trying to do at the Freedom Box Foundation and with the project that it's hosting and sponsoring is sort of a reaction to that. And before I go any farther, I'll start off with a quote that seemed appropriate to me from Ben Franklin, one of the founding fathers in the US. This is a quote that I think about every once in a while. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And in this case, there's a surprising correlation in my mind between safety and privacy. And that's sort of what the rest of this is going to be about. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that we have found ourselves in a moment in history where we willingly hand lots of personal data to companies to manage on our behalf without, as I said, giving a lot of thought to the consequences. And this is all happening at a time when our lives are under increasing scrutiny. As you heard Jake talk about this morning, in the aftermath of September 11th, an awful lot of governments in the world, and even before then and much more since then, lots of companies in the world believe that they have every right in the world to acquire lots of information about us, particularly metadata information. We've known for a long time about this kind of data warehousing and data mining, but somehow watching things that have happened over the last year around the world brings into a little starker relief what some of the point and some of the consequences of this might be. And in particular, when we put all of this information in the hands of other people on our behalf, we need to remember that for-profit companies, no matter how noble the intentions that they state in their terms of service, must operate within the rules of the jurisdictions in which they operate. What does that mean? What I mean is that even if the terms of service say, we won't sell your information, that doesn't mean that they won't respond to a warrant issued by, legally by the judicial system in the country in question to hand over certain information that they happen to have acquired. And this isn't just about you. If this were only about you making the choice to make more of your personal life accessible to people who might want to do things with that information that you hadn't thought about before, I wouldn't worry about it so much, because that's your choice. You can make bad choices, and that's fine. But the problem is that a lot of the interesting information isn't so much about you as about your connection to other people and about those other people. One example that I'll point to, and I don't want to spend all day, I think Jake did a better job this morning than I could possibly do trying to sort of scare you with all the bad news. But are you aware of the fact that every photo uploaded to Facebook, they have now publicly admitted, is being processed as part of the photo DNA program? Have you heard of, how many of you have heard of photo DNA? A few of you, that's really cool. The rest of you might want to Google this and take a look. This is a program that Microsoft and some partners, in conjunction with some government agencies, put together to do things like facial recognition in uploaded photos. And the sort of morally rational basis for doing this is to try and discover and do something about child exploitation online, kiddie porn, that sort of thing. And I think all of us would agree that, that's a pretty reasonable thing to want to try and improve the world situation around. But we already have strong reason to believe that that's not the only way that data gets used, and it certainly opens the possibility that when you go and tag the names of your friends in a bunch of photos, you're helping to create even stronger connections there. I certainly would hope that, don't come back to bite you or any of your friends or immediate family, but how can you know? So, the vision we have at the Freedom Box Foundation, which was initially articulated by none other than Eben Moglen starting a couple of years ago, is this notion that we ought to be able to take all of this stuff that we in the free software community have been building for ourselves over the years and that we know how to use, and to bring it together to build personal servers running free software operating systems and applications that are designed specifically to create and preserve personal privacy. And that we ought to be able to deploy this software on cheap, power-efficient, plug-style computer servers that individuals could afford and install in their own homes. There are a number of things that are sort of buried in this reasonably concise vision that I think are worth calling out. One of them is this idea of cheap. if you want something to really change the world, it has to be possible for it to get into the hands of lots and lots of people. If only smart, rich people can afford this technology, then it won't actually, solve a bigger problem in the world. The power efficient part is really important because there are parts of the world where electricity is, not as easy to come by as it is in our experience. And if you can get it, it's maybe not reliable or maybe it's expensive. So the ability to run things on batteries that you can be charged during the parts of the day where you actually have working electric service or stuff like that can end up being very important. And there's another aspect which is in your home. Because at least in the United States and in a number of other countries that have similar sort of legal structures, there is a fundamental difference between stuff that's in your house and things that you think belong to you but are actually somewhere else. And in this case, the expectations of what's required to get a legal warrant to come into your house to go through your stuff are still substantially higher in the US and elsewhere than to look at your data once it's out of your house and out of your physical control. So in some sense, what we're hoping to do is to make it possible to build a platform which would contribute to building privacy-respecting federated alternatives to contemporary social networks. So I want to be able to do the things that you can do with Facebook and Google Plus and Flickr and Twitter and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But can we make it possible to do those things where you retain more personal, local, direct control over the data and have finer-grained access control over who you share that data with in a secure and potentially anonymous kind of way? There's another aspect of what we're doing at the Freedom Box Foundation that, frankly, I'm not personally the most expert on, and that is mesh networking. There are people in the Freedom Box community for whom this is the big deal. These are the people who worry a lot about what happens when your government turns off the internet for some reason or another. It's not that I don't think it's important, it's just not an area of technology I'm all that familiar with. I haven't ever done a deep dive on that. We're lucky that within the Freedom Box community there are people who are genuinely expert on this stuff. And if we're successful at doing this, if we're successful at building cute little plug servers at a reasonable price with a free software, completely inspectable and security auditable stack on them, then maybe this can end up being a platform which with appropriate federated distributed social networking software could be used to facilitate people collaborating safely and securely with others in building social networks supporting protest and demonstration and mobilization for political change. So pretty big ideals, right? But as I said the other day, when you start thinking about all of these things that are happening in the world that just don't feel right, you have to at some point decide, is this something that I care enough about to try and do something about, and then can I do something about it, and if I can, am I willing to commit myself to trying to make something happen, and that's really what this is all about. So how are we doing this? Well, I suspect that in this audience I probably don't have to spend as much time explaining why the Debian distribution might be a good place to go for technology to start building something like this. But there are a few sort of key things here that I think are worth remembering. Debian is a completely open volunteer organization with a very intense focus on freedom all the way back to the beginning. It's a very international organization. It crosses a lot of legal jurisdictional boundaries. And it has sort of so much support from so many different kinds of people in so many different places that it's a pretty robust organization, a pretty robust infrastructure. And it has sort of all the right technical attributes to be a good place to go pull technology from. It's also true that Debian, unlike lots of other free software operating system platforms, does already run on all of the relevant hardware architectures that we're looking at, and that's important. In fact, it's almost sort of the design center, Debian and Ubuntu together, the sort of larger Debian-based ecosystem, are very much the design center these days for a lot of work that's happening on ARM. And I think it's, it's sort of quippy and trite, but it is sort of true that with the inclusive model that the Debian project has chosen to take, where anyone who's sufficiently motivated to package a piece of software within the packaging guidelines and sign up to maintain that can get that software into the main distribution, unlike in some sort of, contrib package ghetto over on the side. It really is sort of true that eventually all free software ends up being packaged for Debian. And that means that all the free software we'd like to use either is or hopefully will eventually be part of Debian, and we don't have to work so hard. But I want to turn this around in the other direction as well. The more we thought about it, the more we realized that trying to create the FreedomBox software stack as a fork of Debian or as a branch of Debian or even as a sort of customized subset of Debian wasn't really adding a lot of value in the world. That instead, what it would really be neat to do would be to think of the FreedomBox project as almost being kind of like Debian privacy. The notion that future Debian stable releases really could and should have everything in them needed to build FreedomBoxes out of the box. And in order to make that happen, we're building FreedomBox with Debian packages, and any new software that's being created for the FreedomBox is being packaged and delivered via Debian. There are all sorts of places where at the detail level you have to ask yourself, when we come up with a different kind of privoxy config than the one the Debian privoxy package normally comes with, should that become the new default privoxy config for Debian, or should this be packaged and delivered separately? And those are the kind of things that, as we stumble over those sorts of questions, we think them through and we figure them out and do the right thing. But my goal is that by the time we hit the next Debian stable release, that anything that's needed to build a FreedomBox is just there. And what we're doing that's sort of interesting or different or value added is really around trying to package this software for specific target devices, working hopefully, as Jake mentioned this morning, we have more than one team that are interested in the possibility of building some hardware specifically to support the project. It'd be really neat if one or more of those things comes to pass. And then really key to me personally, because I sort of care about making sure that even if I don't succeed at what I'm trying to help this organization accomplish, by putting all of our bits in Debian, they'll survive and be available for other people to build cool things with and to have more privacy creating and enhancing software features in all sorts of other things that they might choose to create. Okay, so let me talk just a little bit about the foundation. When Eben was invited just shy of a year ago to give the opening keynote at FOSDEM and really sort of rock the house with he's a more impassioned and probably more inspirational speaker on this topic than I could ever aspire to be. When he gave that keynote, one of the things he announced was that a new nonprofit foundation had been formed in the US to pursue this work. And very early on, I agreed to join the board of directors of that foundation. So this foundation was called the FreedomBox Foundation. It was founded by Eben Moglen. The members of the board right now are Eben, myself, and Yukai Benkler. If you don't recognize that name, then he's a social scientist who's done some really interesting writing on sort of the intersection of all this technology that we're working on and the cultural changes that can or should ensue as a result. So it's kind of interesting. We've got a lawyer, a technologist, and a social scientist, and not only have we not killed each other, but we actually get along pretty well. We nominated James Vasile, who's a lawyer at the Software Freedom Law Center and works for Eben in that context to serve as executive director. He's immensely passionate about the FreedomBox activity. And I think, frankly, in some ways, he's got the toughest job of all of us, because as executive director, he gets to be sort of the publicly facing cheerleader most of the time and take all of the mundane, boring stuff we're doing and make it sound exciting. We've spun up, one of the things I agreed to do when I joined the board was to create a technical advisory committee. I'll talk a little more about that in just a minute. And then we've put some working groups together to try and tackle specific tasks. To be clear, when we started the foundation, I think the vision we had was that we might be able to acquire some early significant funding from some angel type folks and be able to hire people and put them to work actually doing some of the grunty things that we've had to deal with in the last year. Over time, what's become clear is that the approach that is actually working for us is to treat this much more like a direct free software project, having only those things that can't be done in that collaborative community sort of normal way that we're accustomed to working with each other, pulled in and handled by folks at the foundation. But those things that are being done in the foundation are sort of, we think of them as being broken down into 4 pillars. That first one, technology, is the free software project. That's bringing together the software technology components to build a Freedom Box stack. User experience, you know, if all we did was sort of repackage a bunch of bits and put them out there, that wouldn't be exciting. Because anyone who could pick that up and figure out how to configure it and use it could already take those packages from Debian or some other distribution and put them on a cast-off machine and configure it and use it. In fact, I suspect many of you in this room already use various bits and pieces of the technology that we're trying to bring together to build this thing we're calling a Freedom Box. But if I want my mom to be able to go somewhere and buy a device at retail that she can plug in and have a reasonable expectation that with a couple of comprehensible configuration choices made, that she now has enhanced freedom and privacy, then figuring out how to manage that user experience and what we need to do in user interface design and thinking about how this stuff should work is really pretty important. Sadly, it's one of the areas that we've had the least success in so far. It's been my observation that people who are both qualified to do this kind of user experience design and willing to work for free are hard to come by. I'm really tickled that yesterday, I guess, I've had not one but a couple of folks come up to me and say, hey, you know, that's something I'd like to help with. What do I need to do to get connected? So, you know, cautiously optimistic as I often am about things that, you know, maybe we'll get some more of the right kind of attention applied to that. You can't run a nonprofit foundation without having somebody worry about publicity and fundraising. It's just the nature of the world. Industry relations is kind of interesting. That's the euphemism for dealing with the hardware guys. And the problem is that, you know, since we're building these devices mostly around ARM system-on-chip kinds of products and silicon, almost every company in the world that's doing some kind of an ARM system-on-chip has something on their future roadmap that we'd love to talk to them about. But most of them just won't talk to you about anything that's not released yet unless you're willing to go under non-disclosure agreement with them. And it's just not fair to ask your average free software developer to sign an NDA to get access to forward-looking information about hardware that they may not actually want to have anything to do with. It's definitely not fair to ask a free software developer to go under NDA with a company that, you know, either presently or in the past has been accused, you know, rightly or wrongly of being in violation of the GPL. That's just, you know, it's a bad situation. You can't talk about the things you learned and resolve problems at the same time. On the flip side, if you show up with a project like the Freedom Box and you say, we'd like to talk to you about the fact that your chips might be, you know, just the right thing for this in the future, but we won't sign an NDA with you until you resolve your GPL obligation problems, that's a pretty big hammer, it turns out. So part of what the Foundation's been doing in this pillar is chasing down and fixing some of those things, and actually, as a consequence, being able to collaborate with both silicon vendors and device manufacturers about things we might collaborate on in the future. I would love, for example, if at some point the software stack that we're putting together became the default pre-installed set of bits that were shipped on lots of ARM SoC vendors' development boards. That would just be kind of cool, but we'll see how that goes. So, Technical Advisory Committee. It's an interesting group of people. I'm really tickled to have the opportunity to have their advice, guidance, and insight. I suspect over time this will grow. We started out by picking people that we really, really needed their specific areas of technical expertise in order to be able to make some early architectural decisions. Jacob, you had the opportunity to meet this morning. If you didn't know who he was before, I suspect you know exactly who he is now. Excuse me. Sam Hartman, a long-time security professional, well-known in the Debian communities and in the MIT Kerberos community and so forth. Sasha Meinrath from the New Frontiers Foundation, I think it is, very involved in the mesh networking world, has written a couple of books and is our sort of advisor and point of strongest information about that technology area. Rob Savoy, one of the early employees at Cygnus Solutions, been a GNU contributor for a very long time, the key technical architect and developer behind the Ganache project. And Matt Zimmerman, of course, a longtime contributor in the Debian world, ex-CTO at Canonical, now working on the Locker project, which has some interesting parallels, though exactly how that should all correlate is kind of an open question. As I mentioned, we've been spinning up some working groups. The idea here is that there are so many different areas that we need to sort of get some advice, guidance, and design decisions in, that inviting people who have expertise in those areas to get together and collaborate with each other to provide roadmap elements that we can then coalesce together as we build the software stack is a good way to go. A couple of these that have had some real progress already, the folks working with the DreamPlug hardware that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes have been immensely helpful. The folks working on promotion and visual identity have just about agreed on a new logo that's a whole lot sexier than this sort of freedom with the box in a box thing. And I had joked the other day that by the next time I gave this talk, I would have switched over to the new logo. Thanks very much for making me a liar. That's how it goes sometimes. So behind the scenes, there have been a bunch of things that have happened at the foundation over the course of the last year since we got started that aren't terribly publicly visible, and yet they've been sort of important grunty things we had to deal with. First of all, when the foundation started, we used a Kickstarter campaign to raise the initial seed capital required to do the foundation's legal filings and all of that sort of stuff. And some of the contributors at different levels were promised certain premiums in exchange for their donations. And those included, at several levels, units of actual Freedom Box hardware with some bits on it. And so as a consequence, some of my compatriots within the foundation identified and chose a particular piece of hardware, which is the global scale DreamPlug that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, to be our initial hardware target. And unfortunately, despite the fact that it was sort of the best-in-class device at the time for what we were trying to accomplish, it had some source availability GPL violation kind of issues with it. There were two that really mattered to us. One of them is that the global scale folks had modified the U-boot bootloader and not made the source of the modifications available. I'm pleased to report that we were successfully able to convince them to do the right thing. They released the sources to the U-boot stuff, and it has now all been fully merged upstream. And while I have not done it personally, I'm told by other folks in the foundation that it's now possible to build working DreamPlug firmware using the U-boot source package that's in Debian. So that's totally cool. It's also the case that this device uses a wireless chip that is very similar to the one that was in the OLPC machines that's sort of a micro access point. It has an embedded ARM processor and can do all kinds of whizzy stuff. Unfortunately, the driver that Marvell ships for use with that is not a free software driver. It taints the kernel when you load it. And it depends on a really huge binary firmware blob that gets downloaded to run on that embedded ARM processor in the device. What we discovered is that all of the sort of pre-built Linux images that people were shipping on devices using that micro access point had pre-built binaries of the user space utilities. We were able to convince them not only to release the source code of that, but to do it under the GPL, another minor but fairly important victory. Part of the reason this is so important is that that proprietary driver doesn't use the normal kernel wireless device APIs. It has its own sort of interface model. And so now today, you sort of have to choose whether you want to deal with this big, sort of binary driver firmware blob and use the separate user space utilities, which you have to do if you want to take advantage of a bunch of the access point functionality and goodness that the chip provides, or you can actually use an in-kernel free software driver with the big binary firmware blob if all you want to do is use it as a wireless access client. But that's sort of the last remaining frustration, is that at the bottom of this whole stack, if you're going to use the wireless functionality in a DreamPlug, you're still stuck dealing with a big binary blob, and that just doesn't feel very good. Okay, so let me talk just a little bit more about this thing. As I mentioned, this is a DreamPlug from Global Scale. It uses the Marvell Kirkwood processor, which is a single core ARM running at 1.2 gigahertz. It's got about ½ gig of RAM and a couple megabytes of SPI NOR flash that's used just for holding the bootloader It has an internal 2 GB micro SD card that's attached via USB. That's a sufficiently large device to hold a credible root file system and initial software stack. And then there are a bunch of interfaces around the periphery of the device that can be used for attaching additional storage if you actually wanted to host, your personal photo collection or music or whatever on here. Those include some USB and eSATA. There's an SD socket. It's got, as I mentioned, the Wi-Fi stuff, 2 gigabit Ethernet interfaces. Sounds great, but I'll be honest with you, as we go forward, I'm not so sure that gigabit is such a big deal here. It might turn out that some of these get deployed topologically in places in the network where that's useful, but my observation is that you can load either the gigabit driver or the 100 megabit driver that's compatible with the same hardware, and the gigabit driver just draws substantially more power. So for most of our intended audience, if we were going to design specific hardware, using lower power, cheaper 100 megabit interfaces might actually be just a smarter deal, but that's something we can work out as we go forward. It does have a Bluetooth interface and audio interface. There's been lots of joking about, maybe the audio interface would be a good source of random numbers or something, but it turns out there are other approaches to ensuring sufficient entropy in the device that seem a little more robust than that. But it's a developer kind of unit, not a specific thing we would have built. When we call these plug computers, for those of you who don't know, it's because they come with this little, you can slide in all sorts of different plug adapters. I happen to have the one that allows you to use a separate power cord to actually not have this hanging right on a plug, but you can put an adapter in here for any of the sort of standard AC power plugs in the world, and just plug this into an outlet, plug some network into it, and off you go. This particular device also has the feature that you can separate the power supply. And part of the reason they do that is that some of their previous models have had overheating problems, and a lot of that has to do with heat from the power supply getting into the rest of the board. By being able to separate this with a little DC cable between them, you can help that a lot. But it also means it's really easy to take this and hook it up to any source of 5 volts at an appropriate number of milliamps. I've done demos before where I was trying to show off the low power aspects of this device, where I ran it for the duration of a talk like this on 4 AA batteries and invited people to connect to it and download anything they wanted from the Project Gutenberg DVD that it had loaded on it and things like that, but I didn't bother trying to do that for today. For those of you who can't see from the back very well, that's what one of them looks like, with a snazzy artist rendition of what the old, not so exciting logo might have looked like on the front of the box. So I want everybody to understand, though, that as I mentioned earlier, by putting everything in Debian, on some level, anything that can run Debian could be a Freedom Box. I don't want you to walk away thinking that this is the only thing that can be a Freedom Box. In fact, there are even some other plug servers that are quite interesting. Before the Dream plug hit the streets, its predecessor, the Shiva plug, got a lot of attention. There's quite a few of them out there. It actually has surprisingly similar specs. It only has one network interface, but it has the same Kirkwood processor at the same clock rate with the same amount of RAM. It uses different kind of flash technology for the bootloader and so forth. One feature as a developer I really liked is it had an integrated JTAG and serial console interface. On the Dream plug and some of the more recent devices, Global Scale has gone to having a separate little dongle that does USB to JTAG and serial console. I don't know, I don't really always understand the economics of Chinese production. My suspicion is that by doing that separately and making a gazillion of them all at once, it was really, really cheap. But it means that now if you're actually a developer or an early adopter and you want to make sure you don't brick things, you end up sort of velcroing this little box on there with these chintzy little, fine pitch cables down to it, and it's just not as, pleasant feeling to deal with as having that stuff integrated was on the Shiva. There's also another plug I just got my hands on. There are actually a number of different plug servers, but another one that I've personally gotten my hands on is a Tinito plug. This one also only has one wired network interface, but it has internal support for plugging in a 2.5-inch SATA hard drive, which is pretty much the standard these days in notebooks. And so if your primary interest was in deploying the stack to provide a secure source of files that you wanted to share into a community, then a device like that might be easier to deal with than trying to plug external storage devices into something like this. There are also a bunch of set-top boxes based on ARM devices. There are developer boards like the Beagle board and the Panda board, which Tridge was showing one of that they're using with their UAV stuff. Those are all credible performance ARM processors that can run Debian or Ubuntu or pretty much any other Linux distribution, and which have an interesting mix of peripherals that could in fact make them very useful for this kind of stuff. And so once again, part of the magic in all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that by doing everything in the Debian context, anything that can run Debian can potentially eventually be a Freedom Box. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we've actually gotten done this year, because at the time of FOSDEM, just after LCA last year, what Eben did was paint an amazing vision. And in fact, eventually I had to sort of ask Eben to put the reins on just slightly, because every time he gave a Freedom Box talk, the vision got a little more exciting, a little more expansive, and as the guy trying to figure out how to actually do this, a little more impossible. But this summer, I had the opportunity at DebConf, which was held in Banja Luka, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Northern Hemisphere summer, sorry, so about 6 months ago, 7 months ago, whenever it was. We had the opportunity during the Deb Camp Week to get a bunch of folks who are all passionate about Freedom Box to sit down together and make real progress on a bunch of things. So first off, if you aren't aware, DebConf has a very strong video team, and every year, pretty much all the talks, with the exception of some birds of a feather sessions, are video recorded and made available. There were a bunch of talks at DebConf this summer that have relevant content if you're interested in freedom, security, crypto, privacy, this whole sphere. And so I encourage you, if you are interested in these topics and want to learn more, to go find the DebConf 11 video archives and look at some of the presentations that were made there. But there are a lot of things we did. That's when we packaged the Marvell user space tools. We worked on some scripting tools for helping to build reference implementations. We worked on getting, actually I was tickled that somebody who wasn't even at DebConf saw the activity on the mailing lists and on the IRC channels and popped up and said, hey, I've been doing some upstream U-boot stuff. Can I help you with the Kirkwood Dreamplug support bits? And we said, hell yeah. And by the end of the week, a lot of that work was done, and then it just took a while to get all of the changes accepted upstream. A lot of work was done towards understanding what to do about packaging kernels. Another problem with a lot of these sorts of devices, and this is true of almost all sort of consumer-oriented embedded devices that run Linux, is that the people working on them pick some kernel version, make a copy of the source code, and then just start hacking on it until they get it to work. In this case, when we finally convinced the global scale guys to send us a copy of their kernel sources, I was initially really excited because what we got was like a Git repo. But when we unpacked the tarball and took a look at it, what I realized it was is somebody had done a Git clone and then done a gazillion mods in the checked out tree and never committed any of them. There were no comments, no nothing, right? So a large part of what ended up happening at DebCamp, and this is just frustrating, but it's how the world works when you're dealing with folks like this. We had several really smart people who understood ARM and kernel and so forth stuff really well, who were hunkered down at a table going through everything and figuring out which bits had already been upstreamed for other reasons in more recent kernel trees. And in the end, after they did an amazingly intense burst of work, we discovered that there wasn't a whole lot left as a delta that we had to get merged other than the out-of-tree wireless driver that we would have to deal with forever. And since that time, virtually all of that stuff has been successfully merged upstream. One of the challenges, though, is that this was all happening right in the middle of the ruckus in the kernel community over what do we do about all these different ARM SoC things driving us to have all this, diversity within the ARM ports branch within the kernel source tree. It was a bad moment in history to be trying to do things like get new device IDs accepted and all of that. So that's all kind of taken a while, but as I mentioned, my objective is to sort of make sure that by the time we drop the next Debian stable release, that it's possible for all of the things needed to build Freedom Boxes, including on Dreamplugs, to be in Debian. And I have no doubt at this point that we will have all of the right stuff in upstream kernels and or able to be in the Debian kernel source packages so that that can be true, and we can run a pre-built Kirkwood image on this. There's a lot of stuff that came out of that work. As I mentioned, video replays, a bunch of the wiki pages about the Freedom Box that now exist in the Debian Freedom Box wiki hierarchy came out of work that was done that week. So since then, Hector Oron, who's one of the folks there, did quite a bit of work on helping us to get to where we're actually running package kernels on the Dream plugs. The tool set that we built in Banja Luka for doing pre-install images is called Freedom Maker. Sorry, that's what I came up with one night. That is available for your perusal and use in the Git repository. It's git.debian.org. It's part of the Alioth infrastructure. There are references to that on the FreedomBox wiki pages if you're interested. That tool set basically allows you to start from scratch, point at a Debian mirror somewhere, and from Debian package sources and local scripting end up building a USB stick that can be used to boot a Dream plug and install on its internal SD card. So that's sort of, at the moment, the fastest path to getting a nice set of bits running on one of these devices. I've delivered a couple of developer releases, which I would not call Freedom Boxes. They are, good Linux-based platform stuff running on Dream plugs that have gone to the folks at the foundation. The reason that's important is that that's what has allowed them to fulfill the obligations they made to some of the Kickstarter contributors, and I'm very pleased that we've been able to get that done. There's a lot of ongoing discussion with industry partners. I spent a couple days, I managed to carve a couple days out of my schedule in October to go spend in Eben's offices in New York. We did a lot of work there on talking through how we wanted to manage identity and security and sort of the root of trust in these devices. If you think about it, there's a lot of problems we have to deal with. For example, if you want to do something administrative on your own Freedom Box, you're probably connecting to it over the network. How do you know that that's really your Freedom Box you're talking to and you're not being man-in-the-middle attacked? How does the box know that that's really you and you're not being man-in-the-middle attacked? And then once you start to think about wanting to provide finer-grained access control to your friends and family to control and retain more elements of privacy around the things that you're willing to share with your personal social network, how are you going to do that? Well, after lots of head scratching, it became clear to all of us that all of the sort of technical capabilities we need are embodied in the OpenPGP standard and GPG keys that come out of that standard. The problem is, as any of you know who've messed with it, the user interface to GPG is challenging. Certainly not something that I'll, inflict on, people that I like, much less my mother. And I meant that didn't come out quite right, did it? Hi, Mom. But we also, in our conversation, realized that Eben very strongly cared about some sort of SSH tricks, the ability to open up tunnels for other people to reach through if they happen to be in, poorly connected or filtered parts of the world. And those ought to be low-hanging fruit. But I challenged the folks who work closely with Eben in New York to help come up with a user interface that would make it possible for mere mortals to be able to do things like turn on a little SSH tunneling love for people they wanted to provide that kind of assistance to without having to drop to the command line and edit config files and so forth. And then we realized somehow in the middle of that discussion that that there was another piece of low-hanging fruit, which is that we could add privoxy and do a suitable config so that just by having one of these devices and using it to replace your existing wireless access point or put it in as sort of a router or a proxy between your home and the rest of the internet, that you could afford all of those other random clients running random operating systems additional elements of privacy and safety that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that all kind of got added to the list. I'm pleased to report that in the last week, James has put out his proposal for the initial privoxy config. And those of you who know anything about privoxy and have opinions about how it can or should be used, I would please ask you to go look on the Freedom Box Discuss list, take a look at that config, and give us advice, guidance, and feedback on it. Okay, so what are we going to do going forward from here? Well, first of all, I keep pointing out to people that you don't actually have to have a cute little ARM embedded system to work on Freedom Box stuff. Almost all of the software, the protocols, and the applications that are relevant are things that can be worked on using any box that's running Debian, or frankly, a lot of them, any box that's running Linux. And so don't think that you have to go buy some cute little ARM SoC and spend a lot of time figuring it out in order to be able to help. That's not true. One specific thing we've thought about doing is making it possible for people to get x86 virtual images of the same stack that we would put on a device like this as a way of spinning it up quickly and easily and sort of trying it and being able to provide commentary and feedback. And so that's something, there's actually been some work done on a tool for building those packages. We just need to get it integrated with Freedom Maker and put out another developer's release with it. Another thing that James has done in addition to working on the Privoxy stuff is he created a very lightweight user interface framework that uses Python called Plinth. Part of the challenge, as you might understand, is if you want to create good user experiences, you need to have some consistency in the way your user interface works, and this leads you to start thinking about things like web application development frameworks that would give you some nice snazzy web interface, but they're all really heavy. They have all sorts of dependencies, they build, consume lots of resources, and after sort of scratching our heads over what was available, James ended up just going off and writing a little something. And I'm really not qualified to judge how great it is, but for the things that he's already sort of built guts behind the interface for on it, it seems to work just great, and it is quite easy to work with and navigate. So again, folks that feel interested in or qualified to go take a look at that, that would be great. Out of curiosity, how many of you know about MonkeySphere? Oh, now I'm depressed. Okay, so particularly in the Debian community, folks have created this thing called MonkeySphere, which is a way of using GPG keys to control things like SSH access. Really worth reading up on and learning about. We hope to bring together something sort of like an identity management layer based on open PGP keys and using the MonkeySphere daemon called out from by things like an Apache plugin module to control whether people have access to specific services that are running on a local device, and then in the end to use sort of key signatures and attributes attached to keys as ways of annotating the relationship between devices and their respective owners. And finally, we're hoping as one of our first sort of real applications to deliver a secure XMPP-based chat stack, and we'll keep popping periodic releases until we get to something that feels like an initial feature release. So a little aside, as we started thinking about this whole issue of trying to use GPG keys as a root of trust, it became immediately obvious that one of the challenges we'll have is how do sort of normal people who meet each other somewhere and want to establish a communications relationship going forward, establish that initial computer communications trust relationship. Stefano Maffuli's done some work on this thing called Manus Vexo that other people also think is a pretty cool idea. That's all about using QR codes created from fingerprints to be able to sort of do a high five with your cell phones and trade fingerprint information quickly and easily, which could then be synced back to your local Freedom Box and become the root of association with the network. I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's one of the cooler ideas that people have had and that people are trying to work on. So what can you do if you'd like to help? The first thing I would ask is that you be conscious about privacy and other freedoms in everything that you do. If you are here at LCA, you're probably already helping us. You're probably either working on software that is now or someday will be relevant to people who are trying to do things with Freedom Boxes, or you're learning about it so that you can go back and tell all your friends about it and help to sort of drive an upswell of interest in free software and freedom and privacy in our direction. And all of that's great. If you don't already have a GPG key, might be a great time to create one. And while you're here, and there are folks like me and many others who are here that are in the well-connected web of trust out there, engage in a little key signing activity. It also would be really helpful if people went to this URL, which is all about trying to brainstorm applications that already exist in the free software world that can be used to deploy services that are very much like the things that we have built all these dependencies on that are provided by commercial cloud service providers. Take a look at the applications that are being referenced there. If you have knowledge about others, please add them. If you've never heard of these things, go read up on them, go, oh wow, that's cool, try and install it, configure it, report back to the Foundation's working groups of the wikis on what your experiences were, suggestions about things we should or shouldn't stumble over in config files and all that sort of stuff. Join a working group if you've got time and are willing to help on a more direct level. And a big part of all of that's going to be helping us in the end to select the right Debian packages and figure out how to configure them so that we can deliver a software stack that actually delivers on the various elements of our vision. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the FreedomBox Foundation is a US nonprofit corporation and operates entirely on donations. So if the thing that you have to offer is money more than anything else, then we would of course be happy to have your donations. So with that, I'll stop. I don't know how much time we've got left. I think I've about, as usual, run out of time, but we have time for a few questions?
10 minutes for questions.
About 10 minutes for questions. Excellent, great. Questions? I really can't see where. Somebody over here? Somebody down here? I see it.
Are we going to do this with a mic or with no mic?
Just holler out and I'll repeat them.
Okay. So is the plug server open hardware?
Is the plug server open hardware? Not really. One of the things, if you're in Jake Applebaum's keynote this morning, he mentioned at the end that we're looking at ways of getting some low-cost devices manufactured. Out of curiosity, if we had a device that had, hypothetically a single or dual core, 1.2 gigahertz-ish kind of ARM, let's say a half gig of DDR3 RAM, an adequate amount of flash, a couple of 100 base T interfaces, and a wireless access point capable interface chip, hopefully that could support multiple SSIDs, that was in the under $100 range. How many of you would buy one of those? Oh, I love you. So think about this a little bit, and if there's some killer piece of hardware we could add to that for an extra $5 or $10 that would make you want them even more, let me know, okay? Because we're going to try and figure out how to do that. I don't know when. Honestly, when we started the foundation, one of the things Evan and I agreed on is we weren't going to make this a hardware project, because software is, just in some sense a whole lot easier to work on and distribute. But when I think about all the hours in the past year that I have wasted trying to unwind other people's idiocy around these source availability issues and all of that. As you might imagine, when you're working on a project with Evan Moglen, even hinting at the possibility that you might ship something with a GPL violation just doesn't happen. Not that I'd want it to anyway, right? I mean, those of you who've known me, I realized the other day that I've been a speaker here at every LCA since 2002, and so at least some of you have had a chance to learn enough about me to know that I wouldn't go there even if I didn't have Evan looking over our shoulders. But if I had, if I had a half hour for every hour I've spent in the last year, we probably could have turned on, debugged, and had nicely working some piece of really free hardware. So maybe we'll be able to get there. I don't know. Other questions? Yes, over here.
Have you thought about the Raspberry Pi?
The Raspberry Pi. Yeah, I'm excited about the Raspberry Pi, except Raspberry Pi is really optimized for a different target audience. So what I'm talking about is, wouldn't it be cool to be able to do something Raspberry Pi-ish, but maybe it would be Raspberry Cobbler or something. The problem is that Raspberry Pi has all sorts of, a fair amount of the money in that bill of materials goes towards the graphics interface and things like that we don't want. And it's really only got one network interface. And that's a little challenging for trying to do things that you might want to use as sort of routers or access points or something. So I'm excited by that. The idea of bringing Linux free hardware platforms down to that price point is awesome. I certainly expect to try and acquire some and play with them and all of that. But at the end of the day, what I'd love to have is something a little more like, a little off-the-shelf router or wireless access point that had the right mix of resources to be able to run a reasonably rich software stack and provide the kind of services and have the performance to do the kind of encryption and so forth that we think is important. So exactly like Raspberry Pi, but with a focus on the right feature mix for doing this. Yeah?
I'm trying to understand how people are going to use these things. I mean, you expect them to be mail servers? Do you expect them to people to get an ISP feed and plug it into them, or depend on the mesh networking?
Excuse me. So the question is, how do we actually expect people to use these things? Sort of what's the usage model and what do we expect people to be able to do? In the initial release, the three things that I'm trying to hit for that first sort of baby step feature release are a local-only secure XMPP chat service. So you could invite your friends to sort of come to your server and chat with you and have the equivalent of a channel mechanism and so forth that's all completely cryptographically secure and not using somebody else's cloud infrastructure. A privoxy config so that if you were to situate this machine between yourself and rest of world or set it up to be the proxy that you route traffic through that's relevant, that anybody in your house using a web browser would immediately have a more secure web surfing experience and be giving up less information about themselves unknowingly. You have no idea, if you haven't dug into this, what your web browser tells the world about you every time you go anywhere. It's just kind of scary. And privoxy can help with that a lot. And then this mechanism for using SSH tunneling hacks to help other people. Over time, what we would like to do is move more towards some of the work that's being done, whether it ends up being diaspora or the community I'm personally the most interested in right now, because they build on top of XMPP, is the Buddy Cloud community. They are sort of trying to provide something that you might think of as a Facebook-ish kind of experience, but done without centralized servers and resources that belong to other people that your data then ends up living on. So exactly how do we expect this to be used? I think a lot of people will buy a box and drop it in, replacing a wireless access point or a DSL router or something like that, or being between that device and the rest of their personal network. I think some people will deploy these in places where existing network connectivity is being challenged, using mesh and other techniques to route around the damage that's being caused. I think John Gilmore is the one who noted a while back that the internet treats censorship as damage and routes around it, and that's kind of one of the things that we think might happen. I'm fond of pointing out to people that if you had a little sideways networking with your neighbors, one thing that could happen is if you're in a place where net neutrality issues are cropping up, your ISP doesn't want you to use this service, but your neighbor's using a different ISP and they can get to that service, but they can't get to something else. You could maybe agree to do a little proxying for each other and kind of do an end run around those things. So you don't necessarily have to be on the streets in a Middle Eastern country where the government is turning your internet off and trying to shoot you before some of these features might actually end up being really useful. Grant, did you have a question?
Yeah, how do you handle, so a large part of the value of these social networks is the graph and the discovery of connections previously from that graph.
Right.
What are the thoughts in the Freedom Box Association about that problem?
So I have to be completely clear about this. The Freedom Box Foundation does not intend to build and deliver social networking software. We're trying to build a platform that the people working on social networking software can have their stuff deployed on that will help to make it possible to run that in a fully distributed, federated kind of way. So to answer that question, you should go take a look, for example, at what the Buddy Cloud folks have articulated as the boundary between the services they think they can provide and the protections they think they can provide versus what the experience is that you get with existing commercial services. The problem with the commercial service, of course, is that when you say the big value is all about the graph, most of the value of that graph isn't value that you and I get, right? It's value that somebody else gets about us. It's either they get to know something about our purchasing preferences or our political preferences or our religious affiliations or where we live or who we hang out with or are you or are you not a friend of Jake Applebaum. I did have breakfast with him this morning, just to make that clear. Yeah, well, might as well admit it. Anybody who wants to watch already knows it, because I do have a surveillance device that happens to make phone calls in my pocket. So, all of these things are trade-offs, and at the end of the day, I'm confident that, the path we're headed down is one that not everybody will immediately align with and say, that's a great trade-off. But I can tell you that a lot of our friends in a lot of parts of the world who are currently operating under a governmental or a legal, context different than ours, will jump on this. They'll jump on various aspects of this. And if in the process of building technology for them, we end up building technology that's useful in some way for us in the short term, then, maybe we'll have all the right pieces in place before we need them. And, I jokingly said the other day, the problem is if you think too hard about all the problems that we have to overcome in order to do stuff like this, it is very easy to find yourself thinking that the only right answer is to slit your throat. But the other way you can think about it is, you know, there's a problem, and I'm pretty good at tackling problems. So let's tackle this one together and see if we can't apply free software and all the experiences we've had building cool applications out of free software to make the world a better place. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Vidal.